In this video, we are going to go over step 2 Sharpie on our final drawings for Unit 2. So before we move on to Sharpie, I want you to make sure you're checking your drawing for a few things. So I'm going to be working on this practice drawing for this step. I have made a lot of mistakes on here over time, showing students certain things they should watch out for when working with Sharpie. So that's what this drawing is intended for. But right now you should be looking at your final paper with step 1 pencil sketch done. So your name should be on the back of your drawing, small in the corner with your hour that you have class. We should have drawn light with our pencil as we worked. We should have horizontal, vertical, and receding lines in our 1-point perspective drawing so that it's accurate. And we should make sure that we have met the project requirements. So if I get my Unit 2 packet out, and I open it to the bottom of the first page, it says step 4, project requirements. I should check that I have at least one or more street and sidewalk. And we talked about how you can still meet these requirements, but make some changes to them. So if you have, for example, a boardwalk instead of a street, that's okay as long as you're showing me those techniques. You should have 4 or more signs and 4 or more extras. If you don't have your signs or extras finished yet, because they're more just like penciled in, and that's something that'll be added over time, that is okay. The things that have to be added with pencil before you move on to Sharpie is the street and sidewalk, signs, and then your 8 or more buildings, 8 or more windows, and 8 or more doors. All right, so there are things that we might continue to go back in and keep adding, but the basic structure of our street should be finished. So what I have here is this practice drawing where, like I said, you can see some mistakes. But I want to give you some pointers before you start Sharpie on your own final drawing for Unit 2. So what you want to do first is with an eraser, you might want to lightly go over some areas if the pencil is really, really dark on paper. That just helps when you go over with the Sharpie so that your pencil lines don't show through. So again, I wouldn't have to like fully erase anything. I can just kind of lighten it up a little bit if you feel like some of your pencil lines are pretty dark on your paper. The next thing we want to do is make sure we are using the correct tools. So I have my ruler. If I used a ruler with my pencil sketch, I want to use a ruler with Sharpie. And I have my ultra fine point Sharpie. We are not using anything larger than this ultra fine point Sharpie that I gave you for this project. So if you're still waiting to get that from me, you should not start this step until you have that, because there are certain reasons why we do not want to use any larger Sharpie with 1-point perspective, at least for our project. So what I want to encourage you to do is go over almost all of your lines with this ultra fine point Sharpie. And if I made a line with my ruler with pencil, I want to line my ruler back up and do that same thing with Sharpie. So I'm going to keep going on the sidewalk lines here. If I use my ruler when I created my sidewalk lines, I want to make sure to use my ruler when I do that with Sharpie too, so that everything stays nice and accurate. If you took time to go over to make your lines with a ruler and pencil and then you just freehand it with Sharpie, you could lose that really nice 1-point perspective look. So as I go over things, I want to explain why we're using an ultra fine point Sharpie. So as things go back in space here, you can see everything's done with the same size Sharpie so that things in the back don't just turn all black. For example, if I were to use a larger Sharpie, it might fill things in too much. And things that are closer to me are things that should be darker, not things that are farther away. Things that are farther away with 1-point perspective are going to start to get more like hazy or not as bright or not as bold. So all of my lines that are thicker should be up front here. So I have an example of how I did that in this example here. All of my ultra fine point Sharpie lines are made with this size Sharpie. However, there are some areas like this sign, or this sign here, or this overhang, or this door here, where I thicken things up a little bit. So I use my ruler to intentionally make some areas a little bit more thick. but I did not do that too far back. So if there are areas where you want to add some variety to your Sharpie lines, that's okay, as long as we are not filling in huge spaces with solid black. We are adding color later, so we can do that with color. We can add more to those spaces. One reason why some of these areas ended up thicker is because I might have made a mistake and needed to adjust that space a little bit. So you have a few options in making areas thicker, but again, only with your ruler and only if it's an intentional in a small, very small space, not like the whole side of a building or a whole window or sign. Those should not be filled in with Sharpie. So we're just gonna go around and outline almost everything with Sharpie. Things you might not outline might be things like if you drew a person or a dog, maybe you want to do that with color. Maybe if this is a sign and not a window, maybe I don't want to outline all my letters with Sharpie. Maybe I want to do that with color later. So really the structure of your street, the street, sidewalk, doors, buildings, most windows, most of our structure should be outlined in Sharpie, but I have these bushes here. So maybe, for example, I want to leave those pencil, and that's okay. One thing you're gonna start to see as I go around this drawing is some mistakes that have happened. So if I take a Sharpie and I'm drawing my line and then I pause and I'm chatting with the person next to me and then I keep drawing, I'm gonna end up with this ink dot here. You can see them all over this. That's why I use this as practice when doing Sharpie to show students. If I hold my Sharpie down for too long, that ink dot is going to happen. So that means that I need to work intentionally with my ruler and my Sharpie. I need to be very focused on what I'm doing so that those things don't happen. All right, so it takes a lot of focus and concentration as you go over things with Sharpie as you work. So we should really be fully concentrated on here. Now, what I want you to think about is if we make a mistake like this, what are we gonna do, right? As an artist, if I make a mistake, I need to decide how I'm going to work with that mistake. Maybe I'll decide to fill this area in here with a dark colored pencil later. Maybe that'll kind of hide that dot and you won't really see it from further away. Another option I have is to turn it into something else. So for example, this gutter in the street was not planned. What happened was I accidentally made one of these sidewalk lines come out into the street. So what I did is I took my pencil, sketched in a gutter where like the water could drain into from the street, and then I went over it with Sharpie. So we need to get creative as artists. Mistakes are going to happen if we know that Sharpie is permanent. We need to decide how we're going to fix that or hide it or work with that in our artwork. So those are really important things to think about when working with Sharpie. And eventually we'll get to the point where we're actually done with Sharpie. So I'm going to use this example, at least the top part here. So if I was done with Sharpie, my next step on the project page would be to go over everything with an eraser. So I'm going to erase any pencil lines that I can see. And I want to avoid spaces that might only be drawn with pencil. I want those to stay. They might be really light, but I want them to stay so that when I go over with color, I know where things are supposed to be. So anything that's gone over with Sharpie, we need to go over that whole thing with an eraser, make sure we're getting any pencil lines, and that really helps with our craftsmanship. So before we move on from this step, we should be checking to make sure that we took care of everything with the ultra fine point Sharpie, and we checked our project page to make sure we are done, and we'll be ready to move on to our next step where we add color.